Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasiliti, president of Al Monitor, and our guest today is Dr. Denise Natali, director of the Center for Strategic Research at the National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies, and a former Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations. My conversation with Dr. Denise Natali about lessons learned in conflict stability and how they apply to the Middle East after this short break.
One of the key issues is who's in Damascus, what kind of government is in Damascus, and who we can work with. So I think that once we have some form of legitimate government determined by the Syrian people that can run the state of Syria, everything is not going to magically disappear, but we certainly can channel and allow those types of revenue sharing agreements, power sharing agreements that we saw emerge in Iraq between the Kurds in Iraq and the Iraqi government be formulated in some type of power sharing arrangement in Syria.
Welcome back. Before we bring in Denise Natali, I wanted to share a quick thought on the Biden administration's policy toward Iran. So far, the administration is strengthening the U.S. diplomatic and deterrent position toward Iran every day. At least that's how I see it. First, rather than jump back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal as it's known, Biden has chosen to first rebuild trust and consensus with America's European partners. The Trump administration, in breaking from the JCPOA in May 2018, had gone it alone on Iran. And while the Trump sanctions on Iran, known as maximum pressure, really hurt Iran's economy, in the process, the maximum pressure policies also alienated European allies and undercut the U.S. diplomatic position. The U.S. diplomatic position, it seems to me, is stronger with Europe than without Europe in confronting Iran. Second, in recent years, there has been a more open Israel-Gulf alignment over a shared concern of Iranian intentions. The U.S. brokered normalization agreements known as the Abraham Accords between Israel on the one hand and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan on the other, has institutionalized this trend and in the process further strengthened the administration's diplomatic hand. And all this might be working. Last week, in a potential opening for renewed nuclear diplomacy, Mohsen Rezai, he's the head of Iran's Expediency Council and former head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, said Iran may be willing to re-engage on talks on the JCPOA if the U.S. sends a clear signal that U.S. sanctions would be lifted in less than 1 year. Now, this is significant because it gives some cover for Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, who has so far been steadfast that the U.S. needs to lift sanctions first before Iran would get back into compliance with the Iran nuclear deal. Iran Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif followed up Rezai's comments by saying that he will soon present Iran's plan of action. So perhaps this is an opening for some creative diplomatic choreography, or perhaps not. This all remains to be seen. In the meantime, Iran doesn't and won't take a holiday from its policies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the Gulf. This past week, Yemen's Ansar Allah group, they're known as the Houthis, escalated hostilities against Saudi Arabia in response, it seems, to the Biden administration's initiative to try to bring peace to Yemen. And despite a recalibration of U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia over the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the U.S. is standing behind the kingdom and has sent B-52 bombers to the region as a sign of its support. The U.S. has also not shied away from confronting Iran with force, such as it did this month against Iran-backed militias in Syria. The Islamic Republic is likely to continue to challenge and probe the resolve of the United States and its partners. And the Biden administration, it seems to me, is willing to confront Iran in these theaters. Deterrence goes hand in hand with diplomacy. And now to our conversation today. Dr. Denise Natali is the acting director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies, INSS, and director of the INSS Center for Strategic Research at the National Defense University. She also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations during the Trump administration. Dr. Natali has also held positions with an NGO in Peshawar, Pakistan, with the American Red Cross in Washington, D.C., with the USAID DART at the American University of Iraq Suleimani in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and as a columnist for Al Monitor. Denise is also known as one of the world's leading scholars on Iraqi and Kurdish issues, and is the author of 2 highly regarded academic books on the Kurds. My conversation with Denise Natali begins now. Denise, welcome to On the Middle East.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon. It's great to be back at Al Monitor.
Great to have you back. Let's get right into it. As Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations during the Trump administration, you oversaw the development of a new methodology and innovative metrics for conflict and stabilization policies. And this was informed by the bipartisan Global Fragility Act. Linda Robinson of RAND mentioned this last week on our show. Tell us about these innovations in conflict and stabilization policies in a general sense, and then we can get into how this all may apply in some of the Middle East cases.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. I just want to start off just to reinforce I'm not in the administration, in the current administration. I left my position at state in December 18th, 2020. These are my views, not those of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or the National Defense University, where I'm currently positioned. As you indicated, so this is a really exciting time, actually, because the Global Fragility Act, which was a very innovative step, bipartisan legislation from Congress, that was signed into law in 2019. And from this legislation, the State Department led through the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations with the Office of Foreign Assistance, and in collaboration with our other bureaus, we had very strong interagency collaboration with DOD, USAID, Treasury, the NSC, and Congress, and a lot of civil society. We took months and crafted the strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability. This is a key component of the Global Fragility Act. And we submitted that to Congress. The State Department submitted that to Congress on December 18th, 2020. The purpose of it was to devise more targeted efforts to strengthen fragile states and to promote more stable, self-reliant nations that can become robust economic and security partners for the United States. Now, the key point here is this was a very new approach to stabilization. It required fundamental change in the way that we look at conflict prevention and stabilization. What are some of the new and innovative components of this? One of them, again, stepping back, our approach, the new approach, was based on lessons learned from the past. We knew we could not continue drinking or producing the same wine in old bottles, that what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan was largely, or in many measures, failures to effectively use our taxpayer dollars. And so we needed a new approach. What did that mean? It means instead of externally driven nation building, our approach would be locally driven, tied to clear political outcomes. We would not engage in large scale projects, but start small and then build out. We had to work through locally legitimate actors, invest in partnerships, link our efforts to policy outcomes, and of course, to continuously measure and determine our impact. Partnership is a very big component of this. and that regards compact-based partnerships, bilateral and multilateral partnerships as well. So this was, again, a real effort to look at what we did wrong in the past, and there was also some goodness, and do better by being more targeted. Now, there's a second component to this as well, and the nature of conflict itself had changed. One of the key capabilities of the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations is this very sophisticated capability to forecast violence and global conflict trends through their IMAP. And they use data analytics, look at where conflict is, devise heat maps, and all of this other capabilities. What we found was that, and this has been driven in by the recent Institute for International Strategic Studies report on armed conflict, that conflicts are intrastate, largely not between states, and we are witnessing more non-state armed groups emerge in the last 8 years than in the previous 7 decades. These non-state armed groups have also increased conflict amongst themselves. It's more uneven in lower conflicts and more regional actors playing an outsized role in fragile states. So between the strategy itself to be more targeted and understanding the nature of conflict, we needed a different approach.
Denise, one of the major challenges for post-conflict stabilization has been disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants. That's known as DDR. This has, of course, been a challenge in the Middle East, especially in the region's 3 wars, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, because of the role of non-state armed groups and actors. What did your study tell us about what works, what doesn't, and what we should be doing when we get, hopefully soon, to post-conflict DDR operations in those countries and elsewhere?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. This is I'm glad you brought this up, because this falls from the nature of conflict. The DDR component, and what we called at CSO, at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, we framed that in security sector stabilization, and that is one of the areas of expertise. What do you do with the tens and thousands of armed groups, non-state armed groups, some are called hybrid actors, after wars are over, or during peace processes? And so this was something that we looked at, because these are not any longer official parts of the state, but they certainly need to be considered when you're trying to stabilize regions, particularly at a local level. So even though some of the lessons we learned, or some of the trends that we found, was even though every context is different, there were certain similarities. These non-state armed groups, they may be spoilers, and in many cases they are. They're mafia groups, they're terrorists, but they also assert territorial control. They have de facto authorities, they provide services, and even stability that the state itself can no longer provide. So some of the questions in one of the key debates is, particularly when you're engaging in peace negotiations, for example, do you engage them? If you do, to what extent? There have been some indicators of success in the defections part, and CSO did actively work on defections. You can do that through messaging, and you can do that through a lot of other efforts. Where you get really, where the difficulties come, or greater challenges, when it comes into reintegrating these groups into society. You can also attempt to reintegrate them into state security forces. The vast majority of groups do not give up their arms. There have been some cases during peace process where they have, and that includes Colombia and the FARC. But the reality is, most are going to maintain their arms, and most, if not all, of these groups are not going to go away anytime soon. So then the question is, how do you address them? And we did find, even though that there are individual efforts at local levels, unofficial ways to reintegrate, your most effective strategy is one where the state itself is engaged, the host country government develops a strategy and has laws to support it. And that is not only about individual former fighters. It's about the communities themselves in which they're going to reintegrate. So it's a holistic process that starts from the defections and goes into the reintegration part. But it's you shouldn't expect much, because there has to be categories of these groups, and you'll find that there's a small sliver of categories of these former fighters that are acceptable to the communities. That is, they weren't considered terrorists, they didn't engage in acts, and they're integratable. The real issue is the vast majority that are non-integratable, and therefore they remain a thorn in the security component. So that's one component of the security sector stabilization. How do you set the conditions so that you can then get into some form of also security sector reform? The other way to look at this too, and this is what CSO does, is to, if you want to have a more targeted approach, and that goes back to our global fragility strategy, or the strategy to prevent conflict, is you have to better understand the nature of these groups. And this is where there's pockets of better understanding, but we have found through our work, there's been fantastic work coming out of Chatham House on hybrid actors, but the groups are not homogenous, particularly in the Middle East. Let me focus on them in the Middle East. They're fragmented. They have different degrees of loyalty. Many, if not most, are tied to Iran, but they're not equally tied to Iran. They are horizontally networked, and they are, again, as I indicated before, hybrid actors. So rather than looking at these are the bad ones and the good ones, as was indicated in this very strong Chatham House report by Dr. Mansour, look at them as networked across society. And that leads to a fundamentally different type of policy in dealing with stabilization than as opposed to we're going to find the good ones and we're going to integrate them and then we're going to isolate the bad ones.
When you look at the Middle East and some of the armed groups there and the armed actors, is it possible to even consider DDR with former ISIS fighters? And what has been the success or lack of success for dealing with them? And does that even apply in this case?
Sure. In the Middle East, I can talk to some of the work that we did in looking at, and this was in Africa, dealing with former Boko Haram fighters and other fighters that were tied to ISIS West Africa. There were some metrics and some successes, but that takes a long time. And as I said, you're able to encourage the defections, but you need a very engaged government and security forces to get them not only in to defect, but then you're talking about de-radicalization programs, psychological programs that can reintegrate them with jobs and community services, getting the community itself to even accept their people back into their society. And that's one of the biggest challenges. It's not only once they defect, but most of these groups or individuals, are shunned by the communities themselves. So how do you sensitize communities to be able to take to reintegrate? And I have to tell you, Andrew, there's not a whole lot of success. When you look at, for example, Syria and Yemen, you've got, tens and thousands of fighters, many of them that have just emerged over the last decade or so during the wars, and operating apart from central governments that are barely in existence in the first place. So this is why I go back to, we should prepare to recognize that these groups or these entities are going to be here for a very long time in different forms.
You visited Yemen as Assistant Secretary. The Biden administration is now giving priority to ending the war there. The UN has called it the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. The administration's effort, should just note, has been further complicated by attacks by the Iran-backed Ansar Allah or the Houthis on Saudi Arabia, which has forced the kingdom to respond in recent days. But tell us about how you, when you were Assistant Secretary, approached Yemen with regard to your responsibilities for conflict and stabilization operations, and what did you learn there, and how might those lessons inform post-conflict stability operations in Yemen, if indeed we can get to a ceasefire?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. I did have the opportunity to visit southern Yemen. I was in McCullough with the Yemen Affairs Unit. We went with the delegation. I led the delegation there. And during that visit, I had productive meetings with the governor, local officials, many non-governmental organizations. And one of the key takeaways was that this part of Yemen had very little to do with the civil war that was occurring in the northern western parts of the country. In fact, there was relative stability in some parts where we went, and had some of the conditions that would be amenable for further engagement. We had, again, during the meetings, my many meetings there, when I asked the officials and the NGOs, what did they thought of the potential ceasefire in Hudaydah, because it was at that time that Special Envoy Griffiths was engaged in that national level ceasefire. Most of the people didn't care. It wasn't that they didn't want to stop war, but the answer was unanimously, we care about al-Mukalla. And then they went on to emphasize their most pressing demand over and over, and that was, not surprisingly, services. There's a radio show that goes on in McCullough where people can call in their problems, and again, the surveys and the statements made were overwhelmingly about services. The vast majority didn't even know, in some of the surveys we conducted, that, or were aware that there was a national level peace process going on. Again, not because it's not necessary and important, but because they were focused on the local component. And here I get to what were some of the lessons learned or lessons reinforced. The Yemen, Syria, other fragile states, I've been pretty much across the world, many places in Africa and others. These are highly hyper-fragmented states. So while we engage in very important negotiations and ceasefires at the national level, and I'm so pleased to hear that we have a Special Envoy Lender King leading that for the US government, but there has to also be, at a local level, how do we engage in these local ceasefires? And this is what brings me back to the way that we looked at the Global Fragility Strategy, that this is going to inform what we should expect. You will have pockets of stability, same thing in Afghanistan, and you can start small and work our way out. There's another component to this, and that is regional support. This is, again, a regional issue. It has to be also negotiated with the key regional partners that border Yemen. And so that, in addition to the local, how can you enhance economic opportunities? How can you get trade going again? There's a lot of components to it, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of starting small and going local.
As I mentioned in our introduction, you are one of the leading experts on Kurdish politics and society. How can we understand better the situation of the Syrian Kurds and the relationship on between the Kurdish question in Syria and what's happening in Turkey?
Sure. Let me just go back a bit too before addressing what's happening with the Syrian Kurds, because I do want to tie this back to what we can expect in terms of realistic stabilization policies and what I see as a realistic end state, given that the United States is moving away from Wilsonian liberal interventionism. The Syrian Kurds are a community, a nation, but they are not homogenous like any other group, right? They are in distinct cantons. And if you look at this group historically, from the beginning of the state formation period in Syria, that nationalist project was always, let's say, led by intellectuals from Turkey, then later Kurdish Iraqi political parties, Iraqi Kurdish political parties. And this is not to say that there's not an authentic Syrian nationalism, because there certainly is, but to understand that it has been very transnationalized from the outset. And there is not a geographically continuous group territory, but one in where different cantons or different provinces were treated distinctly from the outset with different dynamics. There are some PKK leading groups, as we know, and there are some that are not, that look at themselves as very clearly part of the Syrian state. So when you ask me what do I see for the Syrian Kurds, I don't see 36 solutions. I see that they are in a landlocked region, highly dependent on regional actors. Their borders are critical. There's a very long border with Turkey, and I cannot imagine, I just can't see it, how this region is going to thrive, to survive, to have its people, be educated and have economic opportunities and live in peace without some way dealing with the Turkish state, and of course with the government in Syria. And we do not have a legitimate interlocutor right now in Damascus, but the end state for the Syrian Kurds would be one in which they are an integral part of the Syrian state, in a decentralized administrative capacity, like other components, and engaged in business and trade with the government of Turkey, or where they can. And in the meantime, as we go about trying to unify Iraqi Kurdish groups, the KDP with the PYD, I know this is good and well-intentioned, but that's, in some ways, I think it's unrealistic. It's not to say that they can't work together, because they can. There's a lot of economic interests going on right now. There's a lot of business going on. But why should we expect two competing groups who have different visions of Kurdish nationalism to come together in different territories and unify their mission? We don't see this in any other parts of the world, and I don't know why we would expect that. I personally would go to the PYD, who has strong authority in some of the areas, and find those groups within. And this is not to de-link them from the PKK, because we all know that there's a strong influence there, but find those groups. There are groups who are willing to work with Turkey, to trade with Turkey, and find those areas where we can do that. So I would focus on economic opportunities. I would focus on opening trade. Look what we did in parts of the Middle East where we never thought the Abraham Accords have forged relationships which were unthinkable years ago. But it started with business, and it started with trade and opportunities and memorandums of understanding. So that's the way that I would approach it, understanding the very real geopolitical limitations of the territories of the Syrian Kurds.
And one final question. Do you therefore believe that the differences between the United States and Turkey and our respective approaches to the Syrian Kurds can be reconciled?
I do. I mean, I'm a cynic in many ways, but it has to. Look, there are certain things where we do agree on. What we do agree on, and one is the territorial integrity of the state of Syria. We agree with it. Turkey agrees with it. That was pretty much tantamount. That was, I haven't heard anyone talk about breaking up the Syrian state and creating an independent Kurdish region, because that was not on the table. It's one of the key issues is who's in Damascus, what kind of government is in Damascus, and who we can work with. So I think that once we have some form of legitimate government determined by the Syrian people that can run the state of Syria, everything is not going to magically disappear, but we certainly can channel and allow those types of revenue sharing agreements, power sharing agreements that we saw emerge in Iraq between the Kurds in Iraq and the Iraqi government be formulated in some type of power sharing arrangement in Syria. There will certainly be tensions. They've existed for decades. As long as the PKK is around, across borders, lodged in Iraqi Kurdistan, lodged in Syria, parts in Iran, there is going to be tensions and a lot of other instability. At the end of the day, this is a key part of this problem. So getting at the PKK issue, and that's going to be something that the governments of Turkey have to work out with the government of Damascus, as well as the government of Iraq and Iran.
Denise, this has been great. Thank you for joining us today on the Middle East.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
I will return after this short break.
I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel Al Monitor.
That was a fantastic conversation with Denise Natali. And I was especially taken not just with the critical innovations in U.S. approaches to conflict and stabilization policies that she discussed, but also her take that while it won't be easy and it's not assured, there still might be some common ground to be found for the U.S. and Turkey in Syria, including and even in dealing with Syrian Kurds. Thanks to our production team of Phil Calabro of El Monitor and Beowulf Roshland of Two Square Media Productions. And thanks to all of you for listening today. We will return next week. And in the meantime, please sign up for this and our other El Monitor podcast on Israel at your favorite podcast platform.